1851. The Great Exhibition opens in Hyde Park, London. 6 million visitors, 34 nations. And tucked inside that glittering palace of iron and glass, something else was being built. Not on display, not catalogued, not photographed. A network. A quiet redistribution of who would own the next century. That's where this starts. Not with a conspiracy. Not with shadowy figures in candlelit rooms. With a date, a building, and the uncomfortable fact that within 15 years of that exhibition closing its doors, roughly a dozen family dynasties across 3 continents went from regional players to genuinely untouchable power structures. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Rothschild expansion into American rails, the Morgan consolidations, the Vanderbilt grip on movement itself. Some of them had modest origins before 1850. None of them had what they had by 1870. The wealth didn't just grow, crystallized. Think of it like supersaturation. You can dissolve enormous amounts of salt into water if you heat it properly. The moment conditions shift, crystals form almost instantaneously. Not slowly, not gradually. All at once, and wherever the seed particle lands first, that's where the structure locks in permanent. Somebody changed the temperature. The official story goes like this. The mid-19th century was a period of extraordinary industrial acceleration. Steam power had matured. Railway networks were threading through continents that had never experienced that kind of logistical revolution. The telegraph compressed time and space in ways that genuinely defied human imagination. You could send a message from New York to London faster than a horse could cross a county. Capital markets were becoming sophisticated. Joint stock companies allowed aggregated investment at unprecedented scale. In this environment goes the argument talented and aggressive entrepreneurs naturally rose. Darwin had just articulated natural selection. The marketplace, Victorian observers believed, worked the same way. The fittest capital survived and compounded. Nothing strange about that. Let me be fair to the official narrative. These families were genuinely talented. Rockefeller's organizational genius in rationalizing the oil industry was real. The man understood logistics and efficiency with something close to preternatural clarity. Carnegie transformed steel production through vertical integration that his competitors couldn't replicate fast enough to matter. Morgan understood trust and credit relationships in ways that allowed him to function almost as a private central bank during periods when the United States had no Federal Reserve System at all. These weren't accidents. These were capable people. And the timing, the official story insists, was simple coincidence of historical circumstances. Industrialization created opportunity. These men seized it. End of explanation. But here's where I keep getting stuck. Let's start with the numbers. Between 1850 and 1870, the percentage of American industrial wealth controlled by the top 10 families went from somewhere around 8% to, depending on which economic historian you trust, between 40 and 47%. In 2 decades, the equivalent figure in Britain moved from roughly 12 to 31% across the same window. Germany, still technically a collection of states until 1871, showed a similar compression into a much smaller group of banking and industrial families immediately following unification. The same window, different continents, different legal systems, different languages, the same compression pattern. Speaking of compression, the railroad land grants in America during this period are genuinely worth sitting with for a moment. Between 1862 and 1872, the federal government transferred approximately 170 million acres of public land to railroad corporations. That's an area larger than the entire state of Texas. And who held the most significant equity positions in those railroad corporations? The same names. Always the same names. Morgan financing here. Vanderbilt positioning there. Gould acquiring something adjacent. It wasn't that they competed with each other for these grants. They structured deals that allowed each of them to benefit from complementary positions. The competition was theatrical. The cooperation was structural. The timeline isn't subtle. Now consider something I found while researching something else entirely. The Panic of 1857. Most people don't spend much time thinking about it, but they should. It was the first genuinely global financial crisis, triggered by the failure of an Ohio insurance company, spreading through banking networks to Europe within weeks via the telegraph, causing bank suspensions across the United States and severe contraction in British credit markets. Thousands of smaller enterprises collapsed. Regional banks failed in significant numbers. The middle-tier merchants who had been building genuine competitive positions through the 1840s and early 1850s were devastated. Who wasn't devastated? The families who had access to private credit lines that didn't depend on public banking confidence. The families who had relationships with European houses, specifically the old continental merchant banks, that maintained liquidity through the crisis precisely because they held assets diversified across multiple national markets. These families didn't just survive 1857. They acquired property, infrastructure, businesses at distressed valuations from sellers who had no alternative. The crisis didn't hurt them. It was, for a very specific category of already positioned players, an extraordinary shopping opportunity. Which brings me to something that doesn't get discussed enough. The timing of information. In the 19th century, the single most valuable commodity wasn't oil or steel or land. It was early knowledge. Knowing a crop had failed before the market knew. Knowing a treaty had been signed before the currency adjusted. Knowing a bank was about to suspend before other depositors could react. The telegraph democratized fast communication, but only for people who could afford private telegraph access and who had built networks of correspondence in strategic locations. The Rothschilds had understood this for decades. Nathan Rothschild's legendary profits following Waterloo were built on exactly this principle, receiving news faster than the market and positioning accordingly. By 1850, that model wasn't secret anymore, but the infrastructure required to replicate it was still enormously expensive. The families who had it used it. The ones who didn't competed on fundamentally different terms. But here's what matters. It's not just that these families had advantages. Lots of people had partial advantages. What made this period genuinely remarkable is that the advantages compounded simultaneously across what should have been separate, competitive domains. American rail, British finance, German industrial banking, French infrastructure investment. These weren't isolated sectors. By the 1860s, they were a system, and the families sitting at the intersection points of that system weren't competing. They were, and I want to choose this word carefully, coordinating. The evidence isn't a smoking document. It's never that clean. But you can trace it through the marriage records, the board appointments, the co-investment patterns, the bearings and the houses connected to American rail, the Morgan relationships with British consol markets. The way that certain deals in seemingly unrelated sectors always seem to find the same small cluster of names on the financing side. The pattern isn't accusation. It's observation. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Let me walk through 3 specific episodes that sit in my head and won't leave. Episode 1. The American Civil War and Cotton Finance. Everyone knows the Civil War disrupted Southern cotton production catastrophically. What fewer people discuss is what happened to the global cotton trade during and immediately after that disruption. Egyptian and Indian cotton markets expanded to fill the supply gap. And the financial structures built to manage that expansion, the trading houses, the insurance arrangements, the letters of credit, concentrated in a very specific set of London merchant banking families who then leveraged those new relationships into permanent positions in post-war American Reconstruction financing. They came in through cotton. They stayed through railroad bonds and federal debt. By 1870, they were embedded in American finance so thoroughly that extracting them would have required something close to revolution. Episode 2. The German unification of 1871. Prussia's victory over France wasn't just military or political. It was financial. The indemnity extracted from France, 5 billion francs, was the largest single wealth transfer in European history to that point. Managing that transfer, the logistics of moving that capital across borders, converting it, investing the portions that Bismarck chose to deploy rather than simply hold, created extraordinary opportunities for the banking houses positioned to handle the mechanics. The Bleichroder family, Bismarck's personal banker, became something categorically different after 1871 than they had been before it. Not because of talent alone, because they were positioned at the exact moment when the largest pile of money in European history needed to move, and they were the ones holding the shovel. Episode 3. And this one is the strangest. The founding of the Suez Canal Company in 1858, and the canal's opening in 1869. The canal physically rewired global trade routes. Ships that had spent weeks navigating around the Cape of Good Hope suddenly had a route that cut the journey to India and East Asia by roughly 40%. The shipping companies that had built their advantages on the old route were structurally disadvantaged. The companies positioned along the new route, or better, the families who held equity in canal operations and in the new shipping lines designed around the shorter passage, accumulated advantages that compounded for decades. And you can trace the equity holders in those early Suez-adjacent shipping positions. They're not random. They connect through holding structures and family relationships to the same cluster of names. Maybe I'm drawing lines between dots that don't belong together. Maybe the appearance of coordination is simply what it looks like when talented people with access to capital all respond rationally to the same set of opportunities. Maybe the fact that the same families appear in episode after episode across multiple continents simply reflects that there were only a small number of families with the capital and connections to operate at that scale, so of course they appear everywhere. Maybe the Panic of 1857 was a genuine crisis that happened to benefit prepared players, with no assistance or acceleration from those players themselves. Maybe the land grant patterns in American rail were simply a product of who had capital to invest, not who had political relationships sufficient to shape which companies received which grants. Maybe the post-Civil War Reconstruction financing reflected natural market dynamics rather than coordinated positioning by families who had already developed relationships during the war itself. Maybe. But here's the thing that won't let me rest easy with any of those mayings. The pattern isn't just about wealth accumulation. It's about the specific architecture of the institutions these families built. They didn't just get rich, they built structures that made their positions self-reinforcing in ways that pure market competition couldn't easily disrupt. Rockefeller didn't just accumulate oil profits. He built Standard Oil as a trust structure specifically designed to make regulatory challenge nearly impossible under existing legal frameworks. Morgan didn't just extend credit. He constructed bank relationships and board interlocks that made his consent functionally necessary for major capital movements. The Vanderbilts didn't just own railroads. They owned the terminals, the switching yards, and the regulatory relationships that determined who else could operate. These aren't the structures of people who got lucky and then tried to hold on. These are the architectures of people who understood, on some level, explicitly or implicitly, that the window they were operating in was finite, and that the goal was to convert temporary advantage into permanent structural position before that window closed. The timing is almost theatrical, and here's where it connects back to that exhibition in Hyde Park, that specific gathering in 1851. What happened at the Great Exhibition wasn't just the display of industrial capacity. It was an unprecedented gathering of the people who controlled that capacity and the people who financed it in a single location for an extended period. 6 months. The exhibition ran for 6 months. Delegations from 34 nations. The merchant banking community of London had an extraordinary opportunity to interact with industrial operators, with government representatives, with the financiers of continental Europe, in sustained proximity at precisely the moment when the infrastructure for global capital coordination was becoming technically feasible for the first time. Was it a planning session? Almost certainly not in any formal sense. Were deals discussed? Relationships formed? Investment structures sketched in private conversations adjacent to public displays? Almost certainly yes. That's what these gatherings do. That's what they have always done. The exhibition closed. The visitors went home. And within 15 years, the map of who controlled industrial civilization looked fundamentally different from how it had looked when those visitors arrived. I'm not telling you there's a committee. I'm not telling you there's a document somewhere that lays this out. I've spent years looking at the primary sources, the letters, the account books, the board minutes that survived, the contemporary journalism, and I have found no smoking proof of explicit coordination across these families as a unified group. What I have found is something more unsettling. I found a pattern of behavior that would only make sense if these actors were, at minimum, operating from shared assumptions about how the world worked, shared information about where opportunities were concentrating, and shared confidence that moves made in one domain would be protected or complemented by moves made in adjacent domains by people they trusted. That's not conspiracy. That's network effects. And network effects, unlike conspiracies, don't require meetings or memos or secret handshakes. They just require that the right people talk to each other frequently enough and trust each other specifically enough that cooperation emerges without explicit coordination, which is, if anything, harder to regulate or challenge than a formal conspiracy would be. Because there's nothing to expose. There's no document to leak. There's just a pattern of outcomes that, over decades, produces a world that looks exactly like what you would expect if a small group of families had deliberately designed it. And maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But I keep coming back to one question that I can't answer, and that I think matters more than any of the specific episodes. If the rise of these families was purely the product of individual talent responding to open market conditions, if there was no coordination, no shared information advantage, no complementary positioning, then why does the geographic and temporal clustering look the way it does? Talented people appear in every era. Every decade produces capable, aggressive entrepreneurs who build significant wealth. Why did this particular generation, in this particular 15-year window, produce a concentration of enduring dynastic power that has no clear parallel in the centuries before or the century since? The Industrial Revolution explanation says, because that's when conditions aligned. The technology was right. The legal frameworks were developing. The capital markets were maturing. But industrial revolutions don't generate dynasties automatically. They generate wealth. And wealth, without specific structural mechanisms to preserve and compound it, dissipates across generations. The fact that the wealth built in this window didn't dissipate, that it instead became the foundation for institutions and political relationships and philanthropic structures that preserved and extended family power into the 20th century and beyond, that's not a product of industrialization alone. That's a product of specific choices about how to convert wealth into durable institutional position. And those choices look, across multiple families in multiple countries, strikingly similar. Which brings me back to the beginning. Not to Hyde Park, not to the exhibition, to a man whose name I won't use here because I can't fully verify the account, but who appears in 3 separate letters from 3 separate archive collections, one British, one American, one German, written in 1853, 1854, and 1857 respectively. In each letter, written by different correspondents to different recipients, this individual is referenced obliquely, not named directly, referred to by what appears to be an agreed-upon nickname. And in each letter, his advice on when to move and where is described as having been proven correct. 3 letters, 3 archives, 3 continents, 1 unnamed advisor. I found this while researching something else. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's a coincidence of record-keeping, 3 separate letters that happen to reference 3 separate people using a similar phrase. Maybe the archives are misleading me. But at 3 in the morning, when I've been sitting with these documents for the 4th consecutive night, what I keep thinking about is this. Somewhere right now, there are families whose names you would recognize without prompting, who live in a world substantially shaped by decisions made in that 15-year window after 1851. And those families, I've spoken to people adjacent to them, people who grew up near that kind of wealth, they don't think of their position as luck. They don't think of it as the accumulated reward of individual talent. They think of it, when they think of it at all, as simply the natural order. That's what successful coordination looks like, a century and a half later. Not a secret, not a hidden truth, just a world that was built a certain way, by people who understood what they were building, and which has been running on those original tracks ever since. The exhibition closed in October 1851. The carriages departed. The dignitaries returned to their countries. The Iron and Glass Palace was eventually relocated, rebuilt, and ultimately destroyed by fire in 1936, taking with it whatever conversations might have been preserved in its walls. We are left with outcomes, with the shape of things, with a world that looks, in its distribution of enduring institutional power, almost exactly like someone planned it. Maybe nobody planned it, or maybe the plan was simply never written down.